Galvanized steel can be a great option when making raised garden beds. Join me today as I show you how I made my steel beds and give you some tips on how to make it easy. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I love my steel raised beds. I have a number of different types of raised beds in my garden. I have many that are made from wood. I have a couple others that are also metal, and I even have some concrete block raised beds. There are different reasons to have different types of raised beds. A big reason I wanted to go with steel for this area is just because this involved some effort, some planning, lots of labor, and I want it to be as permanent as possible. The concrete block bed is relatively permanent, and the steel is as well. With the wooden raised beds, the wood will decompose over time and need some replacing. That's not necessarily the case when you construct something like this. The construction of these beds is pretty basic. I used corrugated galvanized steel panels, often used for roofing. And I constructed a box simply using corner posts and side supports. That simple idea of using these steel panels and screwing them to corner posts is pretty basic, but working with steel can be more difficult than working with wood, which is one reason why so many of us have wooden raised beds. Easy to cut, easy to screw together, and they look pretty good. With the steel, there are some extra steps involved. Now, these corrugated panels are 8 feet long and 27 inches wide. You can easily just make that box with the corner posts and the steel screwed to them. But do you really need a raised bed that's 27 inches high? So that was one of the first aspects of planning as I put this project together. For me, I like a height of 18 to 20 inches for my beds. It's easy to sit on, it's easy to work in. So what do I do with that extra 7 to 9 inches? Well, in this case, I chose to bury the bottom of all of these beds. Remember, I'm looking for a relatively permanent solution to having my raised beds in the garden. I also have issues with voles and gophers in my garden, and by burying these beds, I help to deter the gophers and the voles. By adding in wire mesh at the bottom, I'm hoping that I'll have none of those pest issues in this garden. I'm sure you've noticed that the posts at the front of the bed are cut to match the height of the steel, while these posts at the back of the bed are substantially taller. Well, I designed this for a couple different reasons. First, these tall posts help support this wire fencing that I use to trellis my plants. Using twine, I can guide plants like tomatoes up onto this trellis. I also have some pretty serious weather in the summer. Thunderstorms that drop a lot of hail. So I've got wires that run between all of these posts, and these wires support hailcloth. So this whole area can be covered to help protect the plants during those serious storms of summer. Please recognize that you are free to modify the plans and how I constructed these beds in any way that works best for you. If you want a raised bed that's 27 inches high, 8 feet wide, and 8 feet long, it's a simple matter of just screwing them to the posts, and you can leave this video now. But if it's going to be any other size, stick around so you can see some of the easy tricks I figured out. The first being in how to cut the metal. Even if your bed is 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, you're going to have to cut the metal. The most common way to do that, and with a tool that many of us have, is to use metal shears. The problem with this is that these shears can take a long time to cut through this metal, and your hand will definitely be sore at the end of it. Luckily, I discovered this amazing attachment to my hand drill. This cuts metal. I know. Didn't even know these existed till I actually started using hand shears on the metal and realized I needed a simpler way. With this, I was able to slice through this metal almost like butter, extremely quickly. I designed these beds to be 32 inches wide. Because I have this back trellis, I won't be working from the other side. And for me, with my arms, 32 inches allows me to access the entire bed. For sewing, for thinning, for pruning, for harvesting, this is a good depth for me. If you don't have a trellis like this, well, consider your width to be whatever you can comfortably work from both sides. 4 feet is a typical width of a bed because you can access it from both sides. If you have shorter arms, you might not want to go with 32 inches. You might want to do less than that. This side piece is cut from that 8-foot length. So I can actually get 3 32-inch pieces. Take that into consideration as well. If you're making multiple beds, you want to make as few cuts as possible, whether you're using the hand shears or the automatic cutter. The total length of this bed is 23.5 feet. And I didn't want to cut these panels, so I left them as 8 feet long. And I have the edge affixed to this 4x4 post, and then from the outside edge of that post to the outside edge of this post is 8 feet. And I've overlapped the metal pieces so that the outside edge of this post to the outside edge of this post is 8 feet. Again with that overlap. And then the edge of this post to the edge of the corner post is again 8 feet. But because of this overlap, I lose about 6 inches of measurable space in the middle. That's why it's 23.5 feet long. Not only did I bury the metal in the ground, but I also buried these posts for extra stability. And these are 8 feet long 4x4s. I wanted the height to be about 76 inches above the ground. So that meant I needed to dig a hole 20 inches deep for each of these posts. And I've got 24 posts in this area. Now, traditionally, we use a post hole digger to dig the post holes. And for many of us, that's enough. And if you're just making a couple beds, definitely go with a cheap alternative like this. But my ground is extremely compacted, and it takes a long time to use one of these post hole diggers to dig a hole. So I took the easy way out, and this is one of the best purchases I've ever made. It's a gas-powered auger, and with this, I could cut a 20-inch deep hole in about a minute, often less if the ground was a little bit wet. It's not cheap, but to me, this was well worth the cost of digging all of these post holes. To attach the metal panels to the wooden supports, I use self-tapping roofing screws with a rubber gasket to help seal. At the overlap, I put screws between 4 and 6 inches apart. And along the sides, I then expand it to 12 inches apart until we get to another overlap. While these screws drive pretty quickly through wood, they don't self-tap into metal very well. So if you just have a basic cordless drill, you'll need to pre-drill the holes through the metal and then screw into the wood. Well, especially for a big project like this, that's a lot of pre-drilling. Instead, I recommend using an impact driver or a cordless drill that has an impact driver setting on it like mine does. It turns the drill into a hammer drill so that each of these screws, as you start driving them, are impacting the metal. They bite pretty quickly and then screw right in. This is a great way to save a lot of time with a lot of screws that have to go through metal. To construct this first outer wall, I pre-dug all of the post holes, dropped these 4x4 posts in, and then ran construction twine along the top to make sure that they were all at the same height. Each of these individual posts were then plumbed individually to make sure that they were perfectly aligned vertically. And with everything in place, I then began tamping the dirt around each of these posts to hold them in position, keeping them plumb the entire time. Remember, the metal is buried, so I had to dig a trench between each of these posts and then drop the metal panel into that trench. When the height was right, I then took a level and made sure that the panel was perfectly level before I started driving all of the screws. I used a similar process for these inner walls, but I cut the 4x4 posts to about 40 inches. Now, there's a post on the inside that matches up with a post on the outside. Pre-digging the holes was a piece of cake, and so I just attached the panels to two posts and then dropped them into the holes and the trench that were ready to take them. And then I measured from the inside to the outside to make sure that the inner walls were perfectly aligned, and then leveled, and then I tamped the soil to hold the inner walls in place. I realized that once these beds were filled with soil, that was going to put a lot of pressure on these posts to push them apart. So before I finished filling these beds, I connected each of these posts that run across from each other with a board that was going to be buried, but that would hold these two walls in a position that I wanted them to stay. These top supports are just toe-nailed into the corner posts. I put them in position by clamping the board to the metal, and then when it was in position, driving the screws to hold it in place. Again, I recognized that the weight of the soil in these beds was going to push against this corrugated metal. It's not a rigid piece and will actually bow out against that weight. So I added these extra support pieces in between the primary posts. These were also cut at 40 inches and buried to help give that extra support and try to reduce the amount of bowing on the metal. The inner corners do not have a 4x4 on the opposite side and required a little bit extra thought and planning as far as how I was going to attach the top pieces. One is toe-nailed to the 4x4 and one overlaps. You can see that a project as big as this one takes a lot of planning and preparation and time and effort. But you can build a simple single 4x8 foot bed in just probably a couple hours, depending on the skills and the tools that you're using. At some point, I'll put a gate here, so this becomes a fully enclosed garden. It's up to you to decide if you want tall posts with a trellis or do everything with a low post so that the bed is even all the way around. There's a lot of flexibility in a project like this. No doubt I saved a substantial amount of money by making these metal beds. It would have cost a lot more to get this height and this size if I used lumber instead. And the metal is going to last for a lot longer than the wood would last. So I anticipate that I'll never have to replace anything in this particular garden. I did use pressure treated wood, and even in contact with soil, it's going to last a very long time. If you want to see how I filled these beds, again, thinking about ways to save money, go ahead and watch this video next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.